Well, hello there to all the good people of Ohio and beyond. This is Aaron Knapp, and you're tuned into Unplugged, broadcasting without permission. This is a place where the truth gets louder and we dig deeper, and where we always remember be lawful, not awful. If you want the full stories, the documents, the videos, and everything they don't want you to see, head on over to AaronKnappUnplugged.com, my new home for every investigation, every episode, and every update. And while you're here, be sure to like the video, follow the page, and hit subscribe, and share this with someone who needs the truth. We're building something real here. We're building something fearless, and we're doing it together. Welcome to Unplugged. Let's kick this thing off.
Plug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polished decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script, no leash, no polished decoys. Broadcasting without permission. We don't ask. We lift the curtain and we drop the mask. Unplug with Nap. Yeah, we cut through the noise. No script.
Alrighty there. Good evening, folks. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. It's been a minute since I've been online, so I'm not sure if everything's still set up the same. I had a little trouble logging into the account tonight. I was like, whoa, I almost logged into the wrong account. So let me just see something here. We're going to make sure that we can bring up the comments on the screen. Let's see. Yep. Can you hear me okay, Garen? If you can just type it in the chat, that'd be great. Well, I'm sure if I'm not being heard okay, he'll let me know. But I just kind of wanted to check in with everybody. I know it's been a hot minute since I've been online, for obvious reasons. And since everything's gone down, I've noticed I've become kind of viral. I got like 750,000 likes on Facebook or on TikTok. Now we're gonna play that video for you a little bit later. That ought to be fun. But tonight we're just gonna kind of catch you up on everything. It's gonna be a long one for those that can stick around. And if not, watch it again later. We're gonna try to stick to a script, and we're gonna try to avoid certain names so that everybody's happy. But everything we're going to discuss is public record and a matter of public record. And, you know, everyone else is covering it. I need to cover it. So that being said, this didn't begin with a traffic stop, and it didn't begin with an arrest either. And that distinction matters because what people see at the end of this process is almost never where the process actually starts. And then what you're looking at here is something that developed over time through documented interactions, through public records requests, through written responses from government offices, and through a pattern that only becomes visible when you stop looking at the individual moments and you start looking at the full timeline. And I'm sure everybody out there knows me. For those that don't, my name is Aaron Christopher Knapp, and the work I was doing at the time was not rumor, it was not speculation. It was not commentary built on anonymous claims. It was document driven. It was tied directly to the Ohio Revised Code 149.43, and it was structured around obtaining and analyzing records that public offices are legally required to produce. And the first real break in that pattern came in March of 23, when I submitted a request to the Lorain Police Department asking for communications related to their decision to disable the public comments on their official Facebook page. The request was narrow, it was tied to a specific policy change, and it asked for identifiable records. The response I received was that no records existed. That was not really framed as a partial denial or an exemption. It was a complete statement that nothing existed to explain that decision. And that kind of response carries weight because under Ohio law, it closes the issue unless it can be shown to be inaccurate. What changed the trajectory of everything that followed is that the statement didn't turn out to be inaccurate, right? After continued follow-up, records were produced. Not in full, but in part. including a forwarded email involving internal personnel. And at that point, the explanation sort of shifted. It was no longer that no records existed. It was that some communications were verbal and it didn't need to be documented, and that other materials were being withheld under attorney-client privilege. Now, that shift is a minor technical correction, and under UC 149.43b3, a public office is required to provide the legal basis for denying access to records. Saying no to records exists fundamentally, or is fundamentally different than saying records exist but they're being withheld. One eliminates the record entirely, and the other one acknowledges it and justifies withholding it. That difference is where the pattern begins. Now, the same pattern appeared again in August of 24 when I submitted a request to determine whether any email addresses had been blocked by city systems, particularly those belonging to elected officials. The official response from the city was that no email addresses were blocked. That answer was clear, direct, and on its face definitive. And at the same time, a sitting council member publicly stated that he would block my emails if the system allowed him to do so, and referred to my communications as spam. Now, that contradiction matters because it shows a gap between what's being represented as a matter of official function and what is being expressed as a matter of intent. It demonstrates that the system, or at least the use of it, was not being described consistently across different actors. Now, by the time we roll around to September 23, the situation had already begun to shift from a records issue into something more personal and kind of more strategic. After an incident at Lorraine City Hall, I submitted a complaint asserting that officer reports didn't accurately reflect what had occurred and that the video evidence would contradict the written narrative. The response from Chief McCann didn't address the substance of the evidence in a meaningful way. Instead, he characterized the situation as a Rashomon effect, suggesting that different people could perceive the same event differently, and he referred to me as a vexatious complainant. Now, that language matters because it reframes the issue. It moves the focus away from whether the complaint is valid and, toward whether the person making it is credible. Now, that's a shift from evidence to characterization. And once that shift occurs or occurred, it tends to repeat over and over and over again. Now, following those communications, I made a direct request for all future communication to be connected, by mail rather than email. And that request was explicit. It was acknowledged, and for a period of time, it was followed. Initially, he said no, he wasn't going to do it. And then, unfortunately, then he turned around and did it. And so the problem becomes, hold on a second. Apparently, my daughter needs me to do something right now. Oh, dude, really? Go. Come on. The request was explicit. It was acknowledged. So back to what I was saying. So basically, at first he said this was his chosen form of communication. He was going to keep doing it. But then somebody whose name I won't mention told him to stop. And it did stop for a while. But then it stopped being followed. The communications resumed, including additional messages that continued to use the same characterization, that sequence, request, acknowledgement, temporary compliance, and then a reversal. It's not isolated. It becomes part of a broader pattern where boundaries are recognized and then disregarded once the immediate pressure is removed. By December of 23, the scope of the issues expanded into communications between agencies. I submitted a request seeking emails and text messages between Chief McCann and the juvenile court administrator, Tim Weitzel. Well, that referenced me. Now, response from the prosecutor's office was these communications were not public records because they were tied to employment matters. Well, that position was challenged directly because the communications in question had been shared externally and had been used in decisions affecting my professional standing. Now, once information moves beyond internal personnel discussions and into external transmission and decision-making, the classification of that information changes. That's not speculation. That's grounded in how Ohio law defines records under RC 149.011. Now, at the same time, I was attempting to obtain those communications. A separate stream of information shows that communications about me were being sent outward. Emails from mid-2023 show that the then Chief McCann was communicating with court officials and others, describing me as becoming unhinged, referencing potential criminal action. And those were not internal drafts or notes, right? They were external communications carrying the authority of the office from which they were sent, the chief of police. Well, that matters because it shows that the narrative about me was not contained within a single department or a single issue. It was being shared, repeated, and reinforced across multiple channels. And by early 24, that situation had moved beyond records and into professional consequences. Communications referencing were being sent to licensing bodies and employers while I continued to publish documents based on analysis of the records I was able to obtain. The structure of that work didn't change. It relied on documents, timelines, direct comparisons between statements and evidence, and it did not rely on anonymous sourcing or speculation. At that point, the conflict was no longer about access to records. It was about how the person requesting those records was being treated within the system that controlled them. One of the clearest indicators of that shift appears in May of 24. It was May 19th to be exact. There's an email from the Safety Service Director stating that they were working on a legal pathway to deal with Mr. Knapp. Now, that language is not administrative. It does not describe responding to a request or evaluating a claim. It describes developing a strategy focused on a person. Well, that's a turning point because it reflects a move away from compliance and towards containment or response directed at the individual rather than the issue, me. Now, at the same time, separate investigative work was exposing broader issues within the city's own systems, particularly in relation, well, more recently to record keeping, payroll documentation, prior audit findings that already identified instances where compensation changes were made without clear documentation or justification. Subsequent concerns expanded those findings beyond one single office and into broader questions about whether the city could consistently produce records that accurately reflected work performed. Well, that context matters because it shows that the issues of records were what existed, what does not, and how it's verified was not limited to my request. It was already a known structural issue. So by the time this timeline reaches late 24, early 25, all the components are in place. There's a documented history of records disputes. There are communications between officials referencing me. There are external communications transmitting those characterizations to third parties. There are unresolved issues within the city's own record-keeping system. And then there is a documented shift in the language from responding to requests to dealing with a person, me. Well, what does not exist at that point in any criminal case tied to me. There was none. There was no arrest, no traffic stop, no seizure of a phone, but the record that will later be used to justify those actions is already being built piece by piece. And through these interactions, that's why this whole, section here, this first part matters, because when the enforcement action comes later, it does not come out of nowhere. It comes out of this foundation, right, where we started. And, that's what everybody has to realize is that that's where we're at right now. And this brings us to the end of our first section and technically our first break, but I'm just going to keep rolling. So section 2, the first fracture is, so when the record started moving, sort of without me, right? What happens next is where you see this shift become visible. It's not subtle once it's laid out in sequence with dates, communications, and actual language used by the people involved. Up to this point, the process still fits within something recognizable. There are requests, there are responses, there are disputes over whether records exist, there are disagreements over whether those records mean what they mean under Ohio Revised Code 149.43, and that's not unusual on its own. What changes here is not the existence of conflict, but the direction of information flow and the way that information begins moving through the system without involvement of the person at the center of it. And so the first indication of the shift appears in the communications from June to July of 2023. So when emails originating from the chief's office begin to describe me in language that's no longer neutral and no longer tied strictly to an incident under review. In those emails, I am described as becoming unhinged and the possibility of criminal charges is raised. Those statements are not contained within an internal report or closed investigative file. They are transmitted outward to court officials, third parties. Well, the underlying incident was still being evaluated. Timing matters because it shows that the characterization is not the result of completed determination. It is the part of an environment in which decisions are being shaped. Now, at the same time, a second channel begins to develop involving the juvenile court system and the Office of the Court Administrator. In December of 23, I submitted a public records request seeking all emails from communications between the Chief, James McCann, and the Court Administrator, Tim Weitzel, that referenced my name. The response from the prosecutor's office communicated through Eric Zambo was that the materials were not public records, as I stated earlier, and that position attempts to frame the communications as internal and therefore exempt. However, subsequent evidence shows that those same communications were forwarded beyond internal channels, including to the Guardian Ad Litem program, judicial communications, and employer-related correspondence, and that contradiction is not abstract because it becomes structural. The same communication is treated as internal for the purpose of denying access under 149.43 while being used to externally to influence perception, decision-making, professional standing. That dual use cannot be reconciled within a consistent application of the statute. Now, the requests submitted during this period were not vague or exploratory, because on September 19th of 23, I narrowed a request to all emails sent or received by the court administrator referencing quote-unquote errand map. With a defined date range of September 25th, 23, I followed up again, stating that if the request continued to be denied without specific legal authority, I would go get a writ of mandamus. And on September 28th of 23, I further narrowed the request to a specific communication. An email sent by Chief McCann to Weitzel on July 12th, 2023 at 1:29 p.m. Couldn't get more specific than that. And requested all forwards, replies, attachments associated with that message. Each of these requests was time-stamped and directed to specific officials and grounded in statutory language, right? And while those requests were being submitted, refined, the external narrative continued to develop. Communications originating from private individuals were being forwarded through channels. And once those communications entered the channels, they were no longer treated as unverified claims. They were treated as information that had been transmitted through an official system. Well, that shift in status changes how those statements are received and replied to by others. Now, by late 23, the process is no longer theoretical. It's documented. Requests are being denied on the basis that records do not exist or they're exempt, while independent evidence shows that the communications about me are actively being created, shared, and distributed. Well, that gap between those two realities widens over time rather than narrowing. That gap becomes more consequential when the flow of information begins to move into professional employment context. Now, communications referencing my conduct are sent to licensing boards and to my employer. Those communications are not accompanied by any formal finding of misconduct by the relevant licensing authority. In fact, the Ohio Council of Social Worker, Marriage and Family Therapist Board ultimately finds no violation. Despite that, the communications occur and they carry the authority of the offices from which they are sent. This is at the point when which the system begins to fracture a bit, and in a way that's visible from the outside, right? The same system that denies access to records on the basis that they are internal is simultaneously using those communications externally to influence outcomes. The same system that characterizes a complainant as vexatious is transmitting statements about that complainant to other institutions. The same system that's asked to produce records explaining its conduct begins to shift its language away from responding to those requests and towards developing a strategy directed at the person making them. The clearest expression of that shift appears on May 19th of 2024. Email from the Safety Service Director, which states we are working again on a legal pathway to deal with Mr. Knapp. Now, that sentence is not procedural. It does not refer to responding to a request or producing records or evaluating a claim. It refers to a developing course of action directed at me, and that is a departure from the administrative response and an entry into strategic positioning. And that was sent to members of council and some other people. It was in this whole chain of emails where they were talking about other stuff and me. But from that point on, the context changes. The issue is no longer limited to whether records exist or whether they are properly disclosed. It becomes how those records and the narratives constructed around them are being used and for what purpose. Now, what makes this moment in the timeline specifically or especially significant is not what is happening, but what has not happened yet. Again, there's still no criminal case, no arrest, no traffic stop, no seizure, just No formal charge that would explain the level of communication, the involvement of multiple agencies, or the transmission of the information into external institutions. And yet, the structure that would support that kind of enforcement action is already in place. It's built through the repeated characterizations that move from internal discussion to external communication. It's reinforced through selective production and withholding of records, where information is treated as internal for the purpose of denial while being used externally for the purpose of influence. Now, it is extended through communications sent to employers through licensing bodies without any finding of any corresponding misconduct. And it becomes formalized through the language that reflects a shift from responding to a request to developing a strategy directed at a person. Now, by the end of this period, what exists is not a single dispute, but not a single incident. What exists is a layered record composed of requests, denials, partial productions, external communications, and documented statements that reframe the individual making the request rather than addressing the substance of the request. That record does not yet result in any enforcement action, but it creates the conditions under which the enforcement action can be justified later. It establishes a narrative, distributes that narrative across multiple channels, and it embeds itself within the systems that carry the institutional authority. Now, understanding that progression is necessary because it shows that when the next phase begins, it won't arise out of a single event. It'll arise from everything that's already been documented, communicated, preserved at this point. And that's going to bring us to our next section, which is the letter that nobody was supposed to know existed. But that will bring us to our first break real quick. So we're going to switch over here. And I will be right back. Hey there, folks. If you really want to know what's happening in your hometown, the place to go is Lorain Daily and Vermilion Daily. From city council and school boards to local businesses, community events, and neighborhood stories, these outlets cover what the big media ignores. This is hyper-local news for real people in real communities. Visit Lorain Daily and VermilionDaily.com today. Read it, share it, support local journalism, because your community deserves coverage that actually lives here. Hey there, folks. If you really want to know what's happening in your hometown, the place to go is Lorain Daily and Vermilion Daily. All right. That brings us to section 3. And open up some windows and get a little warm. The letter that was not supposed to exist. Now, there's a point in the story where speculation ends and documentation begins, where inference gives way to a fixed record that carries a date, a time, a sender, and a defined group of recipients. Well, that point arrives with a communication sent on July 11th, 2024 at 3:10 p.m. by former Chief James McCann to leadership within the Ohio Council of Social Worker and Marriage and Family Therapist Board. And it was not a document that appeared through routine compliance, nor was it produced in response to prior public records requests. That specifically sought McCann's communications concerning Aaron Knapp. It surfaced later, kind of recently, outside the expected production change. That distinction matters because once a responsive document exists and it's not produced, the issue expands beyond the content and into compliance, implicating RC 149.43b1, which requires prompt availability of public records, and 149.43b3, which requires that any denial be accompanied by a specific legal basis. The existence of this email, coupled with its absence from the earlier productions, reframes the entire sequence that follows, but the communication itself begins with an explanation that reveals persistence rather than routine correspondence. McCann writes that this was his third attempt to transmit the information, explaining that prior efforts failed because Knapp's email address was allegedly flagged as spam, requiring him to convert the material into a PDF to ensure delivery. Now, this is not incidental language. It establishes that the transmission was intentional and repeated, and demonstrating that the sender was committed to ensuring that the content reached the board leadership. The tone then shifts from explanation to characterization. McCann's informing the board that in nearly 24 years of law enforcement experience, he has never encountered a social worker who behaves in the manner that he attributes to that. me. He asserts that Knapp can, quote, continues to hide behind his status as a social worker, end quote, and frames my conduct as that of a private citizen rather than a licensed professional. Well, these statements are not neutral descriptions about conduct. They are narrative framing directed to a regulatory authority whose role is to assess professional fitness. They are presented in a way that invites the board to view subsequent information through that lens. The timing of that communication is anchored to a specific public event. McCann referenced the July 8th, 24 Lorraine City Council meeting, including a precise timestamp with the recorded proceedings using the interaction to question whether I was acting within the scope of my license. In doing so, a moment of public advocacy becomes the foundation for a licensing inquiry, transforming a public interaction into a professional issue through the act of transmission itself. The escalation becomes explicit in the next position or portion of the email because McCann states that I've accused public officials of felony conduct, yet him, and responds by asserting his own conclusion that I, and I quote, has and is continuing to commit multiple crimes. If that's the case, why didn't he ever arrest me? But he stated, including the filing of false affidavits in various courts. Now, this is not framed as uncertainty or inquiry. It's presented as an opinion communicated directly to a body responsible for regulating my professional license, thereby elevating the allegation from a local dispute into a matter with potential licensing consequences for the second time. Because he sent the other one the first time. This is the second filing of this, apparently, where he was sending this email. It seems like after they had made their first decision. I could be wrong. I got to go back and look at that. But bottom line is I'd never received this email, which is blatant. And it feels like it's after that because it refers to McCann's previous conversations with Bill. And Bill was Bill Haggerty, the time the president of the board. Now, at the same time, McCann's attempting to define the nature of the communication in a way that does not align with its substance. He states that the email is not a complaint. He's describing it instead as a request for clarification. But the structure of the communication contradicts that label. It contains allegations, references to supporting documentation, and a request for an evaluation on whether I should be continuing to be recognized as operating within professional standards. Functionally, it operates as a complaint regardless of how it's described. The most consequential portion of the email is where McCann explains what occurred after he initiated contact. He references the prior communication with Bill Haggerty, and who was also serving as board president. He states that after providing documents at Haggerty's request, these materials were reviewed and an investigation was opened. Well, that statement establishes a direct and documented sequence of causation. Information was transmitted from a local law enforcement official to leadership of the licensing board. The materials were evaluated at that level, and the board initiated an investigation. As a result of that transmission, the communication does not remain confined to the clarification or the explanation note. McCann further writes, well, it's about time someone takes a deep dive into this guy and sends somebody up here to start interviewing people to get to the bottom of this, end quote. This language reflects an expansion beyond a narrow licensing inquiry into a broader investigative posture. He is suggesting that the matter should move to a document review, to an active field investigation. This is a chief of police up my butt. The recipients of that email reinforced its significance. Communication was directed at Director Carnahan, Chief Fowler, and Chief Adredrin. The problem is that I don't know who Chief Fowler is, but Chief Administrative Investigator Margaret Ann Adredrin, I can't say her last name right, is one. I'm assuming Director Carnahan was a new director at this point, and after Bill wasn't. Chief Fowler, sounds like McCann might have been using AI, and it just got this guy down as Chief Fowler, because I can't find a Chief Fowler that works in Lorraine. But it was directed to my board, so I'm assuming those are all people on the board. He got titles wrong a little bit. But when considered alongside the reference to the board president Haggerty, the email is situated at the highest levels of decision-making structure responsible for determining whether an investigation is initiated and how it proceeds. Well, that placement confirms that the communication was not peripheral but central to the process that followed, and the real-world consequences align with that sequence described in the document. An investigation was opened by the board. Professional consequences followed, including impacts on employment that were tied to the same narrative environment, with termination actions involving the approval of the juvenile court judges. However, the outcome of that process did not sustain the claims that triggered it. After review, the board did not find misconduct, warning, discipline, and I was cleared. I was later reinstated as a guardian ad litem, and they were going to let me transfer over to Cuyahoga. Now, those outcomes stand in direct contrast to the framing presented in the July 11th communication by McCann. That contradiction is not a minor inconsistency. It's a defining feature of this section. And it's something that I just recently got after multiple times of being told that either stuff didn't exist or when it finally did exist, they didn't give me that. I don't know why suddenly I got that. But the letter, therefore, serves as two functions simultaneously, right? It documents how the process was initiated. Oh, excuse me. And it demonstrates that the conclusions reached at the end of the process did not support the narrative that set it in motion. Now, the existence of the document introduces a separate and unavoidable issue concerning disclosure. The email directly concerns the subject matter of prior public records requests, involves the same individuals, and falls within the same time frame as communications that were explicitly sought. Its absence from earlier productions raises questions about the completeness of those responses and whether the legal requirements governing public records were actually satisfied or ever have been. When a document of this nature surfaces after the fact, long after the fact, it does more than clarify what occurred. It alters the framework through which the entire sequence must be evaluated. That story is no longer limited to the actions taken, but also must account for what was not disclosed while those actions were unfolding. As we get to our next section, now it's going to be a long one, so I'm just going to keep rolling. The communications were not isolated; they were searched, collected, and produced. What elevates this whole area that I'm about to go into beyond the allegation is the existence of a formal records production that defines in precise terms how the communications were located, filtered, and ultimately turned over. Now, this is not a situation where a single email surfaced informally or through a leak. The City of Lorraine's IT department documented the methodology that was used to extract these records, because I have that email. And that methodology itself becomes part of the story, because on August 12th of 25, Dave Comer of the IT department provided a written explanation accompanying a USB drive containing .pst email archives, files responsive to a public records request. The explanation is not vague. It outlines two distinct search parameters used to locate communications involving my name. The first was narrowly constructed. It required the emails to include Tia Hilton, Chief James McCann, and that entire message body contained the words NAP. The second search expanded outward, capturing communications tied to Lorain County Sheriff's domains, again filtered by the presence of my name within the content. That matters because it eliminates ambiguity. And those are not stray references or incidental mentions. These are communications that were deliberately filtered to isolate discussions about me, across departments, across agencies, and across individuals who they were actively communicating with one another. When those search parameters are placed next to the emails themselves, the structure becomes clear. On April 3rd, 25 at 10:19, Tia Hilton sends a message to Chief McCann and board-related recipients. This was, I believe, in regards to my CDCA board that later she attacked with McCann's blessing, apparently. The email included a video link that reiterates the same core allegation that a licensed individual, me, is engaging in inappropriate conduct online. The tone remains persistent and escalating, emphasizing repetition with their statement, "I'm going to keep emailing you until you take action," is what she said. Later that same day, April 3rd, 2025, at 9:50 p.m., Chief McCann responds with a statement that has already been introduced but now must be understood within the broader discrete data set. He writes, quote, "I applaud your effort, but you're wasting your time and energy reporting anything to the board, period. Nothing will change." Well, that statement's not just dismissive, it's predictive of institutional inaction and directly discourages reliance on regulatory oversight. The point, before I move on past that, I'll just say this. He's talking about two different boards. So when he said that board won't do anything, he was talking about my social work board, but Tia actually complained against my CDCA license, which was the Clinical Drug and Alcohol Counselors Board. And then the next escalation occurs on April 4th of 25 at 6:06 a.m. when Hilton responds again, and their tone shifts from compliant to threat of exposure. She writes, "I'm calling the news. I will show these emails to the news to show everyone had a fiduciary duty to stop this, and they didn't." She continues with, "I'm calling my legal team. I'm going to let the world know how broken it really is." At that point, the communications are no longer limited to reporting perceived misconduct. They're explicitly framing a public narrative, invoking media involvement, and asserting that multiple parties failed in a duty to act. Well, the problem is when that sequence is read in isolation, it's presented as a heated exchange between a complainant and a police chief. When it's read in context with the formal records and church it produces, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes evidence of a sustained communication chain that's identifiable, searchable, and preserved within government systems. The contrast between the narrative and the outcome, is a place where those communications next to the documented outcomes are already established on the record. July of 23, the Ohio Counselor, Social Worker, Marriage Family Therapist Board issued its determination. The language is direct, leaves no room for interpretation. The committee did not substantiate the allegations in the complaint. The case is now closed. On September 19th of 25, the Ohio Chemical Dependency Professional Board reached the same conclusions. The allegations do not implicate a violation under a code of ethics. The case is dismissed and closed. Those are not procedural dismissals. Those are substantive findings, substantive findings that the allegations are, as presented, did not meet the threshold required to establish a violation. Now, at the same time, the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services determined in a connection with my termination on August 2nd of 23 that I was discharged, quote, without just cause, end quote, under RC 4141.29D2A, that its determination carries its own legal weight. It's an independent finding that underlying justification for my termination from the courts was not supported by the evidence required under Ohio law. When those outcomes are placed next to the April 25 communications, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. On one side, there are repeated statements predicting harm, asserting instability, and urging action based on escalating claims. On the other side, there are formal determinations issued by regulatory bodies and state agencies concluding that those claims did not meet evidentiary or ethical thresholds. Now, what this basically establishes is it's not about tone. It's not about whether the language used in those emails was appropriate or inappropriate. It's about what happens when unverified allegations are amplified through official channels. What those same allegations are being evaluated and ultimately rejected by the bodies tasked with determining their validity. The records production shows that these communications were not isolated. They were part of a searchable, documentable pattern. The emails show the narrative being pushed, included predictions of future harm and calls for public escalation. The official determinations show that when subjected to formal review, those allegations did not hold. That's where the legal and investigative weight sits, because once the narrative is crafted through official communication channels, copied into regulatory bodies, and preserved in government systems, it's no longer just speech, right? It becomes part of the process. And then when that process produces outcomes that contradict the narrative becoming circulated at that time, that question is no longer about what was said. The question becomes why it's being said, who amplified it, and what the impact had on the truth was being determined, right? All right, so that brings us to Section 5. Now, the hearing that stopped itself. Now, before I get into this section here, I am going to take a quick break because we're going to start talking about the court and how things, the block and all that good stuff. So I'm going to take a quick break here and grab a water because I just feel like this background's really hot. I'll be right back. I'm going to go ahead and just put up my standard ad and play some, VA hold music for you, and I'll be right back. if you've ever sat on if you've ever sat on hold at a VA hotline, you'd know that that's that's our little playlist that they play that song consistently in every VA system that they have. Doesn't matter where we're at. It's that same narrative. Opus number one, they call it, I think. Oh man, I'm sorry. My stomach is just kind of upset tonight, and it's been really affecting the way I'm talking. But so here's the point of the story where the hearing stops being about normal hearing and starts revealing something deeper about this entire situation unfolding, right? Like up to this moment, the city of Lorain is attempting to justify, they pop into this situation. They do this sweeping ban. It's a directive that bans me from all municipal property. And they do it by walking the court through selected portions of a video from February 16th of 2026, while framing my conduct as part of what they repeatedly call a pattern and practice. The structure of their argument is clear, right? And it's built around interpretation, tone, and characterization rather than any formal charge conduct at the time. However, what matters is not just what the city presents, but how the court reacts to it, because more importantly, what the court chooses to do next. And when the hearing, resumed after a recess that was taken in the middle of the hearing at like 11:19 to 11:42 on March 26th, well, the tone of the proceeding changes indefinitely, and it does not return to a neutral evidentiary posture. Instead, that tone, the magistrate begins by placing her reaction to the evidence directly on the record in a way that shapes the rest of the proceedings. She states in full, without qualification, based on the evidence that I've seen so far, I have to admit that I'm appalled by the behavior. And that statement's not procedural. It's not analytical in a legal sense. It's a reaction. It becomes the lens through which everything that follows is viewed. Now, she then expands upon that reaction by stating that the behavior she observed was, quote, not only unprofessional, end quote, but also, in her words, involved, quote, threats, quote, following, and what she described as almost harassing behavior. She goes further and states that the conduct, as she understood it from the video clip presented, actually could be the subject of a civil stalking protection order, end quote. She does not stop there. She adds that if such a matter were before her directly, she would grant it, and then escalates again by stating that behavior may actually rise to the level of criminal matter. Now, she does say she would recuse herself if it came before her now, but at that moment, the nature of the proceeding changed. What began as a civil hearing on a temporary restraining order keeping the city from enforcing this ban on me, that legal avenue they were looking to get, it basically is now being openly discussed in terms of potential criminal exposure. And this is happening before the evidentiary record has even been fully developed, before all the witnesses have been called, before any formal findings have been made. The reaction is based on partial evidence, one-sided partial evidence, and the hearing has not yet even reached a point where I've had a full opportunity to present my case or contextualize the material being shown. Instead of continuing with the evidentiary process, the court makes a decision that defines the entire section, or the entire hearing. It basically says the magistrate states clearly, I'm not going to continue the evidence with the evidence at this point. That's not a pause, right? That's not a scheduling adjustment. It's termination of the evidentiary hearing midstream. She's done. The process has stopped before completion, and it is stopped because the legal standard has been, not because the legal standard has been satisfied, just because the court's reaction to what it's seen so far. What follows is one of the most important contradictions in the entire record. So, and then immediately after expressing strong concern about my behavior depicted in the video, the magistrate turns to the city of Lorain officials there, and she says, I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but I don't feel that based on the evidence I have so far that it's been done properly. Now, that statement acknowledges two things in the same time. First, the court's clearly troubled by the conduct presented, me. But secondly, and equally important, is the court is acknowledging that the city has not used the correct legal mechanism to impose the ban that's currently in effect. She then makes that point explicit by stating, I just don't feel there is a proper vehicle here to ban Mr. Knapp from City Hall or any building at this point. Well, that's not ambiguous. That is a direct statement that the legal foundation for the directive is insufficient based on what's been presented. The behavior, whatever the court believes it to be, does not eliminate the requirement that the government act within lawful authority. And at this stage of the record, the court is acknowledging that the city has not demonstrated that authority. However, rather than ending the matter there, the court shifts direction again and begins outlining what the city could have done or might still do. The magistrate states that if there were a criminal matter pending, or if this were a civil stalking protection order in place, or if other lawful mechanisms had been used, the result the city is seeking might be achievable through those channels. She goes on even further and states, I'm actually shocked that the city hasn't filed some type of petition or criminal charges. And then adds that the conduct, quote, may rise to the level of criminal menacing, end quote. This is an extremely critical moment in the record because the court is simultaneously acknowledging no charges exist, at the same time suggesting that they could or should exist. The implication is clear, even if not framed as a directive, the current action may be legally defective, but other actions could be pursued to reach the same outcome. Well, my response in the moment is immediate, and it's preserved on the record because I stated it. I said, it is retaliatory, and then followed with, there is other evidence, Your Honor. That's just one piece. That response brings the focus back to context, which is central to the entire case. The video shown is not the entire record. It's one portion of a larger body of evidence, and the hearing is being stopped before the larger body or broader context is fully presented. Instead of issuing a ruling on a temporary restraining order, the court orders a briefing. The city is given till Friday to submit a brief providing legal authority of its actions, and I'm given till Monday to respond. Magistrate said the city can produce an ordinance, statutory authority, or other legal basis. The court will address the motion at that time, and evidentiary hearing may need to be reconvened. And that's procedural. It's significant because it means the city is being given an opportunity to retroactively justify a directive that it's already been issued and enforced. Enforced, mind you, by the police. That's the problem that Chief Fowling and at minimum Lieutenant Thompson find themselves in, because I have Lieutenant Thompson on video and Chief Fowling on video stating that they were going to enforce this city ban, this administrative ban given by Tim Williams. Well, so since it's already been enforced, the decision is not being made based on a complete evidentiary record. It's not being made on a fully developed legal argument presented during the hearing itself. Instead, the process is paused to allow the government to supply the legal framework that was not established during the proceeding. And this is where the contradiction becomes unavoidable. The court orders that the ban remain in place during the briefing period. The magistrate says the ban will stay in place during this briefing period. So even after acknowledging that the proper legal vehicle for the ban has not yet been demonstrated, this means that in real time, the restriction continues to be enforced while the legal justification for it is still being developed. The hearing concludes shortly after 12 p.m., but even the conclusion reflects the same underlying intention. The court orders a controlled exit, stating that I am to leave first, clear the elevator, and then exit the building before the defense is released. And this is not simply logistical. It reflects the reality that the very issue being litigated, access to public property, is still being actively controlled while the court has yet to determine whether that control is lawful. When the hearing is formally adjourned at 12 p.m., the record reflects a proceeding that did not reach a conclusion on the merits. It did not complete the evidentiary process. It did not resolve the legal question at issue. Instead, it produced a set of statements, reactions, and procedural decisions that now define the next phase of the case. And what happened on March 11th, 26 is not just a hearing, it was a turning point. The court expressed concern about my conduct, acknowledged deficiencies in the city's legal authority, suggested alternative pathways, including criminal charges, and allowed the restriction to remain in place while giving the city time to justify it after the fact. That combination of facts is what drives everything that comes next, and it will set the stage for the next section, where the focus shifts from the civil directive to the criminal process and begins to develop alongside it. I want to point out, like, not only did that happen in that civil case, and they did follow that roadmap, obviously, to open their criminal case. But the other issue here is that, so while I may have asked to have the judge, and initially I complained about the magistrate, and the judge's response about the magistrate was, well, she ended up eventually siding with you, which she did. The magistrate sided with me and said that the city was wrong, their administrative ban was not proper, and she sided with me. Then it went to the next level. Some other stuff happened, and Judge Cook said to me, well, you should be happy with the decision. She sided with you. And my response back in all of this was, just because she sided with me on one thing because she did the right thing doesn't mean that I'm happy with everything she said or did, because the way she classified me and clarified herself on the record is going to be problematic moving forward, and it's proven itself to be. So I ended up having Judge Cook, asking that Judge Cook be looked at too for his statements. The problem is before she left, the city appealed the magistrate's order to Judge Cook, and Judge Cook turned down the city's appeal. So in the grand scheme of things, they ruled that the city's administrative order was unlawful or not the proper, boat for this, ride. And the problem there is that Chief Fowling and the lieutenant had already acted on the administrative order and kept me out of a city council meeting. So if at that point they hadn't reached any obligation legally, then that means those two individuals then used color of law to restrict my movement and going into a city council meeting under, false pretenses. They trespassed me from a public building without the appropriate, legal backing for said trespass. Now, when the case leaves the courtroom, what happens, starts to see it doesn't remain at the level of this local dispute. It escalates into a formal proceeding before the highest court in the state of Ohio. And that shift is not symbolic. It's procedural, immediate, and legally significant in a way that changes the posture of everything. So on April 23rd, just the other day, the Supreme Court, I've got the filings up here. I posted them online. They accepted formally accepted my filing of affidavit seeking the disqualification of the presiding of the judge in that case, Chris Cook. And that's not a casual filing. It's not treated as one. The entry itself makes it clear that the filing is accepted. It gives the codes and the specific provisions governing judicial disqualification in the state of Ohio. It's precise and it matters. It states that except under very limited statutory exceptions, Judge Cook is immediately deprived of any authority to preside over the case until the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Ohio rules on the affidavit of disqualification. Now, they could still rule in his favor, but the bottom line is that the things that were said needed to be addressed. And the authority of the trial judge to act in my case was effectively suspended, and control of the issue now shifts upward to the Chief Justice. And this is not a delayed effect. It's immediate. It places a pause on the civil case and the judge's ability to continue presiding over that case or over that matter in a way that he had prior to that filing. The Supreme Court doesn't simply stop at simply acknowledging the affidavit. It issues a direct order requiring Judge Cook to respond, and the scope of the response is not left vague. The order requires that the judge file a written response that specifically and fully addresses in detail each factual allegation raised in the affidavit. That requirement is critical because it does not allow for a general denial or a broad statement of disagreement. It requires a point-by-point response to the factual claims that form the basis of the disqualification request. And then the order provides detailed instructions on how that response must be prepared and submitted, and it allows for submission in the form of a letter, a pleading, or an affidavit. It also imposes strict filing requirements. The response must be in 21 days of the date of the entry. It must be submitted either in person, by mail, or by delivery of service, or electronic to the clerk of the Supreme Court. If submitted electronically, it gives, it wants it in PDF format or bigger files, USB, yada, yada, yada. And then it says, it asks for formal evidentiary matter to be involved. Documentation beyond written filings include the very types of video evidence that are central to the March 11th hearing. The structure of the process ensures that whatever is being reviewed will be preserved, organized, and subject to scrutiny in its standardized format. So once the judge's response is received, the process moves to the next stage, which is clearly defined in the entry. The Chief Justice will review the affidavit of disqualification. The judge's response and any supporting materials will then issue a written decision. That decision will determine whether the judge remains on the case or is removed from it. That's not a recommendation or an advisory opinion. It's a binding determination issued at the highest level of the state judiciary. And at the same time, the Supreme Court makes it clear the materials associated with this process are public record. So unless they are specifically sealed or designated as confidential, any person may request access to the affidavit, the response, and supporting materials. Now, that transparency is important because it places the entire dispute, including the allegations and the judicial response, within the realm of the public accountability, so you guys can all get it. And in addition to the entry directed at the parties, it's separate notices issued to the clerk of Lorraine Court of Common Pleas, and it's required under the law that directs the clerk to formally enter the fact of the filing of the affidavit of disqualification on the docket and the underlying case. And that step ensures that the trial court record reflects the fact that the judge's authority is under review and the case is subject to intervention by the Supreme Court. When this is placed in the broader timeline, the significance becomes more apparent because on March 11, 2026, the trial court conducts a hearing in which the evidentiary process is halted before the completion. Strong statements are made about the nature of the conduct at issue. The city is told that it may not have used the proper legal mechanism to impose a ban, even as the ban remains in place. And on April 23rd, the matter escalates to the Supreme Court through a formal affidavit of disqualification, and the authority of the trial judge immediately eliminated pending review. Well, the sequence matters because it transforms the nature of the case. What's being as a dispute over access to municipal property and the interpretation of speech now includes a formal challenge to the neutrality and the authority of the presiding judge. The focus is no longer limited at what happened in a hallway or what was said in a video. It now includes whether the process itself has remained consistent with the requirements of due process, judicial impartiality, and lawful procedure. From this point forward, the case exists on two tracks at the same time. One track involves the underlying dispute between me and the city, including the temporary restraining order and any related claims. The other track involves the Supreme Court's review of whether the judge who presided over those proceedings should continue to do so. Those two tracks are not separate in their impact, and the outcome of the disqualification proceedings has the potential to reshape how the underlying case proceeds, who hears it, and how prior actions are viewed. That'll bring us to section 7. I'm going to be honest, I don't know that we're going to get through all this tonight, folks. Well, I don't know what to tell you, Garen, on the buffering thing. That might be on your end. It could be on mine. I think this is going to take more than one podcast. So I'm going to start the section 7 here, but there's like 25 sections to this podcast. So it's going to be a little ongoing thing. I'll probably have to come back a little bit later and do more. But so when a civil case turned into a criminal process, now what we end up was, up to this point, everything we've walked through has lived inside that civil frame. The focus has been access to public property, directive issued by the city on a temporary restraining order, and then on the escalation to the Supreme Court actually came later through an affidavit of disqualification, because it took me like 3 tries to get it right. I messed it up the first 2 or 3 times, and then I finally got it right. And so, but the entire sequence from February 16, 26 to April 26 is grounded in questions about speech, access, and process. But that's not where the story stops, and it's not where the pressure on this case ends, because while the civil side of this case is unfolding, something else is happening at the same time. And it's happening in a different system with different rules, different standards, and far more immediate consequences. And that's where the shift begins. It's not subtle. The same conduct is being debated in the civil courtroom in terms of whether it justifies a ban from City Hall begins to reappear in a criminal context. The language changes, the framing changes, and most importantly, the consequences change. What was described as a, quote, pattern and practice, end quote, in one setting begins to be reframed as, quote, probable cause, end quote, in another. And that shift is what leads directly to the arrest, the seizure of my phone, and filing of multiple criminal cases arising from the same core set of facts. To understand this shift, you have to look at what the civil hearing revealed, not just in its terms of what it said, but in terms of what it suggested. During that March 11th hearing, the court itself stated on the record that the behavior it had seen, quote, may actually rise to the level of criminal matter, end quote. And then went even further to say that it was, quote, shocked that the city had not filed some type of petition or criminal charges, end quote. That statement does not create a charge on its own, but it signals something important. It signals that the conduct is being viewed through a lens that extends beyond civil remedies. And then almost immediately, the structure of the case begins to reflect that shift. What had been a single stream of events begins to fragment into multiple criminal filings, including another civil case that was for the protection order for carry-on luggage. Carry-on luggage is never something you want to take with you on things. But you had this one hearing for the first protection order for one of the people. And that one went on. And then you had this plethora of other four that showed up as well. And all of them were being addressed sort of in a unified record in one proceeding. And the same facts were addressed repeatedly across multiple dockets, with the risk of any issue not really being raised in the individual case could be treated as waived. At the same time, that focus of the investigation moves from public conduct to personal data. This is where the seizure of my phone became central to the story. During what begins as a traffic stop, my phone gets taken pursuant to a warrant, and then that moment becomes one of the most important points of the transition of this entire narrative, because once the phone is seized, the case is no longer just about what was said in public or what was captured on publicly available video. It becomes about what the state believes it can find inside my phone, I guess, and whether that device can be used to support the theory that's been developing across both the civil and criminal proceedings. The way that the seizure is described both in reports and in my own account really kind of raises immediate questions. Like, I stated that I definitely wasn't given a meaningful opportunity to review the warrant at the time my phone was taken. The officer later claimed in his report, though, that I had been allowed to see it, and that discrepancy is not minor, like detail. It goes directly to the credibility of the officer involved, and the integrity of the warrant process itself. If the warrant was not properly presented, or if the account of his execution is not accurate, then the foundation for the seizure becomes subject to challenge. And that challenge is not hypothetical. It becomes the basis for a Franks hearing. And that's the legal mechanism used to challenge the validity of a warrant affidavit on the grounds that it contains false statements or material omissions. The fact that such a hearing is being pursued tells you that the defense is not just disputing the interpretation of the evidence, it's questioning whether the accuracy and completeness of the sworn statements used to obtain that evidence in the first place. Now, at the same time, another issue begins to surface, and this one cuts across both the civil and the criminal sides of the case. The foundation of the prosecution appears to rest, at least in part, on an unrecorded interaction between the court and the charging officer, which turns out to be Coglinus, whose name is just all over everything, and is also in the previous filing and letter by McCann showing that he participated in filing all these complaints against my licensure as well. And so that occurred in around March 20th of 26. Now, according to what's been placed on the record, the interaction took place in chambers without a court reporter and without a recording and without any transcript, and there's no documented account of what was said, the evidence was presented, or the representations that were made. That absence matters because it creates a gap that cannot be filled after the fact. If probable cause is being shaped by information presented in the setting that it was not recorded, there's no way to test that information, no way to compare it against the sworn affidavit, no way to determine whether the material facts were omitted or mischaracterized. When that lack of a record is combined with the continued sealing of the warrant affidavits themselves, the result is that both the sworn and unsworn basis for probable cause exists outside of any accessible reviewable record. While all that's happening, the narrative that began in the civil case continues to carry forward. Same themes appear again and again, but in a different form. Statements that were originally described as public commentary are now being framed as potential threats. Conduct that was described as expressive activity is now being evaluated under statutes governing telecommunications harassment and related offenses. And the individuals involved, many of whom are public officials or connected to government activity, become central figures in this civil and criminal narratives. And what ties all together is timing, well, and me. The events that form the basis of the criminal charges are tied to a specific time period, primarily January of 26, and there is no indication of ongoing conduct. repeated communications or escalation beyond the initial set of events, which was a podcast or something. The speech at issue was publicly available, not directed to specific individuals, and was accessed indirectly through third parties. And that's important too. Those facts are not incidental. They go to the question of intent and whether it's central to many of the charges that have been filed. At the same time, my device was seized. It doesn't align with the timeline of the alleged conduct. See, they took my phone during the traffic stop, was a brand new device that I just activated at the beginning of that month. So the phone in question, that if I had used it to record this video that they're talking about, was already sent off to be recycled. It didn't exist anymore. And so I don't understand like what they can get, even if they could get off of it. Like, it doesn't contain data from that relevant period. And if what that, if that's accurate, then the evidentiary value of the device becomes highly questionable, and continued retention of it raises additional concerns about the scope, necessity, and reasonableness under the law. When you step back and look at the full picture, what emerges is not a single case moving through a single process. It's a layered structure, and the same underlying events are being examined simultaneously through multiple legal frameworks. The civil case raises questions about access, authority, and First Amendment rights. The criminal case raises questions about intent, communication, and statutory elements. And the procedural issues, including the unrecorded in-chamber interaction and the sealed affidavits, raise questions about whether the process itself is functioning in a way that allows for meaningful review and challenge. And this is where the story changes. It's no longer about what happened in a hallway, or what was said in the video, or whether a directive was properly issued. This is about how those events are being translated into legal action across multiple forums, and then whether the structure of those actions allows the underlying facts to be fully examined, tested, and understood. From here, the next step is to isolate the criminal process itself, to look at the charges, the statutes being invoked, the roles of Lieutenant Galinas as the affiant, and the way in which the warrant, the seizure, and the multiple case filings are being used to construct a theory of the case now extends far beyond the original civil dispute. And, so we get into this next section here. What happens is the timeline is not something that can be dismissed as coincidence. It's not something that can be reduced to ordinary legal progression. There's a moment where the record itself shows the court identifying a deficiency, outlining alternatives, and then the subsequent actions of the city aligning with those alternatives in a way that raises legitimate questions about process, neutrality, and the integrity of how the case has evolved. To understand why this matters, the focus has to return to what actually was said in that on the record in that March 11th hearing. Like, the magistrate did not simply deny relief or defer ruling based on incomplete evidence. Instead, she made a series of statements that went beyond evaluating the directive itself and moved into describing both the conduct and the potential legal pathways available to the city. She explicitly stated that she did not believe the city used a, quote, proper vehicle, end quote, to impose the ban that had been issued. That alone is a legal conclusion about the mechanism being used. However, she did not stop there. She went on to further articulate the proper vehicle could look like, explaining that if there were criminal proceedings or if a civil stalking protection order had been pursued with enforceable distance restrictions, then the city might be able to achieve the same result it was attempting through the directive. Well, that statement's not abstract because it's not theoretical. It's a direct articulation of the alternative legal strategies capable of accomplishing the same restriction on access. She then went on to reinforce her point, even stronger language, stating that the record that she was shocked that the city hadn't filed criminal charges, and that the conduct shown may actually rise to the level of a criminal matter, specifically referenced criminal menacing. Well, that statement does not determine guilt, but it does something equally important in the context of the process. It signals that the conduct being reviewed, at least in the court's view at that moment within the criminal framework, had not yet been invoked. And at this point, the city had attempted to impose a broad administrative restriction without citing a statute, without presenting a criminal charge, and without relying on protection order. The court identifies that as insufficient, and then identifies exactly what would be sufficient if properly pursued. That's the moment where the roadmap is created. Rand McNally actually, I think, sent the court something, the best map of the year award. For those of you that are younger, if you are here, like, Rand McNally makes maps. But the significance of that moment doesn't come across as from the existence of those legal tools. Criminal charges and protection orders are legitimate mechanisms within Ohio law. They exist for a reason. The significance comes from the sequence that follows, because the record does not show a departure from that roadmap. It shows movement directly into it. After the hearing, the posture of the case begins to change. The same underlying conduct that's been framed as justification for administrative ban is now reframed within criminal statutes. Instead of arguing whether the city had the authority to restrict access to municipal property, the issue becomes whether the conduct constitutes telecommunications harassment, menacing, or related criminal offenses. Instead of a directive, there are now formal charges. And instead of a unilateral ban, there are mechanisms that carry enforceable legal consequences through the criminal system and protection order framework. At the same time, that fragmentation of the case into multiple criminal filings begins to take shape. What had previously been discussed as a pattern tied to a single stream of conduct becomes divided into separate counts, separate case numbers, and separate procedural tracks. Each one carries its own burden, each one own evidentiary posture, and its own potential penalties. But all of them stem from the same core set of facts that were already before the court in the civil context. That shift's not minor. It changes the entire structure of the dispute and moves the matter from a form of a question of administrative authority into a question of criminal liability on yours truly, and it does so in a way that mirrors the exact alternatives identified by the court in a civil matter. Kind of funny how that works. And this is where that concern begins to move from what happened to how it happened. And the courts are tasked with evaluating what is presented to them. They are not tasked with advising one party on how to restructure its case to achieve a different outcome. When a court identifies a deficiency, the expected function is to rule on the deficiency based on the law and the record. When the court instead identifies alternative legal mechanisms that would produce the same restriction, and those mechanisms are then pursued, the sequence creates that perception that can't be ignored. That perception is not based on speculation. It's based on timing, language, and alignment. The timing is clear because the statements identifying criminal and protection order avenues occur before those avenues are pursued. The language is clear because the court did not speak in generalities. It spoke in specific categories that definitively and directly corresponded to the mechanisms later used. And the alignment is clear because the actions taken after the hearing track those categories with precision. When those three elements are present together, the issue is no longer just whether the city had legal authority to act. The issue becomes whether the process that led to those actions remained independent or whether it was influenced even unintentionally by guidance provided from the bench. That question becomes even more significant when viewed alongside everything else that's already presented in the record and present in the record. There is an unrecorded in-chambers interaction in the criminal matter involving the affiant and the criminal matter. There are sealed affidavits that prevent review of the sworn basis for probable cause. There's a warrant executed under disputed circumstances, including whether it was presented at the time of seizure. There is continued retention of a device that by the state's own theory is not the source of the alleged conduct. There is a case structure that divides the single stream of expressive activity into multiple criminal files. I mean, they called my phone, possession of criminal tools. Each of those elements raises its own set of concerns. And when they're combined with a sequence in which the court outlines a legal path on how to do it, the path is then followed. The concern begins to overlap in a way that cannot be dismissed. And none of this requires a finding of intent. It doesn't require a conclusion that any individual acted inappropriately or improperly in a deliberate sense. What it requires is an acknowledgement of what the record shows, how the record would be viewed by an objective observer. An objective observer would see a court that expressed strong views about the conduct before the full evidentiary process was completed. That same observer would see the court identifying specific legal mechanisms that could be used to restrict that conduct. That observer would then see those mechanisms implemented shortly thereafter, transforming the posture of the case in a way that aligns directly with that was described. That's why this whole area here matters and why it connects directly to what comes next. Because once the roadmap's drawn on the record and the actions that mirror it or follow mirror it, the focus becomes the focus of the analysis shifts. It's no longer about whether the charges can be proven. It's about whether the path that led to those charges preserved the appearance that and reality of a neutral, independent judicial process. And that question is in play. It doesn't stay confined to one hearing or one motion. It becomes central to the entire case moving forward. So that brings us to section 9, the roadmap removal, why recusal is not optional and when the record itself is in question. Now, at this point in the story, the focus has got to kind of change a little bit, and deliberately, because up till now, everything's been about conduct and what happened in the hallway, what was said in the parking lot, and what was recorded and what was interpreted, and how those interpretations are turned into legal action. And this is where most cases begin, and that's where most cases stay. This one did not stay there because, once you reach this stage of the record, the issue is no longer just what happened. The issue becomes how the system responded to what happened and whether that response remained neutral, detached, and grounded in the structure the due process requires. And that's where recusal comes in. This is not a situation where recusal is being raised casually or as a tactic. This is a situation where the record itself forces the issue because the standard of review under Ohio law does not require proof of bias. It requires something much simpler and at the same time much more powerful. It requires that a reasonable person looking at the record would question whether the judge can remain impartial. The standard is codified under section 2701.03, which governs affidavits of disqualification. It doesn't ask whether the judge intended to be unfair. It doesn't ask whether the judge believes they can still be fair. It asks whether the appearance of impartiality has been compromised to a degree that confidence in the process itself is now at risk. Not my words, that's their standard. And that's the lens through which everything has to be viewed. And when that lens is applied to this record, what emerges is not a single isolated issue. What emerges is convergence of events, statements, procedural decisions that, when taken together, create a pattern that can't be ignored. The first pattern piece is what occurred in open court on March 11th, 26. And the evidentiary process before it was completed, before I even had an opportunity to fully present my case, because technically I was the plaintiff, prosecution, whatever. The court made strong, unequivocal statements about conduct at issue, including me. The behavior was described as appalling. It was characterized as harassing. The court went further and stated that it believed that the conduct could support civil stalking protection orders for multiple individuals and that it may actually rise to the level of a criminal matter, specifically reinforcing criminal menacing. Those weren't neutral observations made by the court. Those are conclusions, or at minimum, highly developed impressions about conduct that has not yet been fully litigated. They place the court in a position where it's already expressed a view about the nature and severity of the behavior before the process is designed to test the behavior has been completed. The second piece of that pattern follows immediately after. The court identified that the city had used the wrong mechanism to impose its ban, and then it went on the record, outlined the mechanisms that could be used to achieve the same result. Criminal charges were identified, protection orders were identified. The court made it clear that if those tools were used, the city could potentially reach the exact same result. And that moment is the critical moment because it shifts the court's role from evaluation and evaluating what's been presented to describing how the presenting party could correct its deficiencies. And the third piece is what happens next, and that's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The case does not move away from those suggestions. It moves directly into them, like a train crashing into a wall. Criminal charges are filed. The protection order mechanisms are all pursued. And the same conduct that was discussed in the civil context is now reframed with criminal statutes, divided across multiple cases. And someone ends up locked up for a minute. Now, that sequence matters because it creates a direct alignment between what was said in the court and what was done afterwards. That fourth piece of the pattern involves what did not occur on the record. There was a substantive interaction between the court and the affiant in the criminal matter that was not recorded. I believe the affiant was Kyle. I'm not for sure, but it seems like he was. It was not transcribed by a reporter and not preserved in any reviewable form, and that's a violation, I think, of Criminal Rule 4. At the same time, the affidavits supporting the warrants in the criminal case remain sealed, preventing any meaningful challenge to the sworn basis of probable cause per the records that I've seen filed publicly. And that means that the foundation of the criminal case exists in significant part outside the record and outside the ability of the defense to examine or test it. And then that fifth piece involves the way the case itself has been structured and what was originally a single stream of conduct, or at least two separate incidences, because you'd have to look at the October 20th, supposed violating the Meeting Act thing. That's one. And then everything else was from this February event and a January podcast. So I guess technically there were three separate cases. But we're and by we I mean the court, the city is trying to look at them all as one and the way they respond, and except for when they send orders out, they send out orders on each case, and that becomes problematic. The fact that what was originally this issue based on a publicly available podcast and an expressive activity, right? That was never sent to anyone has been divided into multiple criminal cases, each carrying its own charge, its own exposure, and its own procedural posture. That fragmentation increases pressure, increases complexity, and alters the legal landscape in a way that would not exist if the conduct had been addressed as a single unified matter or in three separate unified matters, whatever they wanted to do. But that, and then the sixth piece of this is something that might seem smaller on its own, but becomes significant when placed alongside everything else. The court acknowledged that those filings submitted, by me in my other case were well organized, legally grounded, and not frivolous. And at the same time, Judge Cook questioned the authorship, suggesting that the quality implied that I must have had them prepared by an attorney because I was trying to hold the city accountable with sanctions. That's not a legal determination. That's an inference about capacity and credibility that is separate from the substance of the filings themselves. When a court accepts the legal validity of a filing but questions its origin based on its quality, it introduces a perception issue that grows beyond the law and into how the party presenting the argument is being viewed. When all is said and done, when all of those pieces are placed together, the question is no longer whether any single action was permissible. Each one standing alone may be explainable. Courts can express concern about conduct. Courts can identify legal deficiencies. Prosecutors can file charges. Affidavits can be sealed under certain circumstances. Cases can be structured in multiple filings. The issue is what happens when all those things occur in sequence, in alignment, and within the same case. At that point, the concern is no longer isolated. It becomes structural because the appearance that emerges from the record is one that the court has expressed strong views about the conduct, identified the legal mechanisms that could be used to address the conduct, and then those same mechanisms were implemented in parallel proceedings now form the basis of prosecution. That doesn't require a finding of intent. It doesn't require a conclusion that anyone acted inappropriately or improperly in a deliberate sense. It just requires one thing. It requires asking whether a reasonable person looking at the record would question whether the judge can remain impartial going forward on these matters. Under Ohio law, if that question can be reasonably asked, recusal is not discretionary, it's required. That's why the affidavit of disqualification was filed with the Supreme Court of Ohio. It's not one that was filed casually to set aside. It had to be pursued, refiled, forced through the process multiple times before it was formally accepted because I kept messing it up. That says something about the resistance encountered even in getting the issue in front of the appropriate authority because I had to get every last little thing right. But once it was accepted, the effect was immediate and automatic. The Chief Justice has to rule. They shut it down. They're not allowing Judge Cook to move forward on that. And the entry issued by the Supreme Court confirms the matter is now under review at the highest level of the state. It requires a written response from the judge addressing the facts. It will be evaluated not based on speculation, but based on the record. And that's where this moves from argument to adjudication. That's where the broader significance becomes clear because this is not just about one case, one defendant, or one set of charges. This is about how the system functions when criticism of government intersects with the power of the state to investigate, charge, and prosecute. It's about whether the safeguards that are supposed to protect that process remain intact when the pressure increases and the scrutiny intensifies. Because if the appearance of neutrality is compromised, the outcome of the case becomes secondary. The process itself becomes the issue. Once the process is in question, the only way to restore confidence is to step back, reassess, and ensure that the case proceeds before a judge whose impartiality is not reasonably subject to doubt. That's not a request for advantage. That's a demand for a process that can be trusted. And at this point of the record, it's a demand for the law to itself to recognize necessity. Now, I think this might be a good time to stop. We're at section 10. And like I said, we've got about 27 sections. So I think that at some point we have to take a break here. It's been over an hour and a half. And what I'll do is I'm going to break this up into sections. But I'm going to point out section 10 is going to be the stop, the warrant, and when all of this turned into a seizure. But as we move forward, I just want to acknowledge, and when I say a new judge, I don't mean in the criminal case. I mean, it would have to be a new judge in the civil case. But for argument's sake, when the criminal case is found in my favor, I don't see the civil cases moving forward. one civil case that they brought up in one court, I believe in Rothgary's court, is currently on hold pending the outcome of the criminal case, as it should be. And then, of course, this other case is on hold based on the recusal issue. And while it was on hold, Judge Rothgary also signed the warrant, the initial warrant to seize my phone, which we're going to talk about. And so we have all these interactions, and then the municipal judges have all recused themselves. So the only people that haven't is the prosecution and the police. And so we have a lot to address when it comes to that, and we're going to address that in the next episode of our podcast. But this brings us to where we're at. I wanted to address the fact that I wanted to get to the point where we address the fact that I did get the recusal filed, and obviously we still have 21 days to figure out what happens there, but it's bringing attention to this case in a way that it needs to be brought. And the thing other people need to understand is any podcaster out there should be worried that they'd be able to do this to you. I mean, it has a lot of parallels to Ashley Ford. I said it wouldn't be long before they started coming after me the same way they came after her over dumb stuff. And yeah, sure, she's won, but they keep coming. They keep harassing her. I had to spend a lot of money just to get where we're at right now. A lot of money. And they're stealing money from a disabled veteran so they can charge me. So, just keep that all in mind. Everything that I'm talking about now is public record because it's all been filed in the criminal case on the record, and therefore it is public record. It's not subject to any withholding or anything like that. When we get into the next portions of this podcast, it gets much juicier as we move forward. This was the initial intro part. And, our next episode will be section 10, the stop the warrant, and when this turned into a seizure. And we'll talk about where everything changed in this situation, because before that point, it lived in hearings, emails, directives, and arguments about authority. What happened next, that's more about whether the city can say something or restrict something. That's about the government physically stopping a person, removing him from his vehicle, and taking his property under color of a warrant. And that's, you guys look at that however you want. Color of one warrant that then became another warrant that we still haven't seen the affidavits for either. So, we will be seeking, we already have a Franks hearing to my knowledge, but the city is arguing that we shouldn't be allowed to have a Franks hearing, and still hasn't provided all the video and discovery, even though they provided so much video to the other reporters. And that kind of makes me question a lot of things. But anyway, I thank you guys for tuning in tonight on our first podcast back. Again, I would appreciate it if you're not sharing this with any of the people that are listed in criminal actions against me right now. Those individuals, this is not meant for them. If you send it to them, I don't authorize you to share my work with those people because it will get me in trouble. And I'm not trying to get in trouble. But I just want to just let you guys know that we'll be back with the next, probably 10 or so knocks on this one or more to finish this podcast and this long narrative of what's been going on since my arrest and my video. But before I go, I will give you this. I do want to address this before I go. So a lot of people haven't seen it, whatever. But we're gonna go out on a positive note. And we're going to play this little fun ditty.
With all your favorites from local journalist Aaron Knapp.
Piggy, piggy, piggy. Here comes the piggies coming to enforce their fake laws on people. God forbid you write a story about Lorraine police, right? Because then they're going to retaliate against you and fuck you in the ass. Hey, piggy, 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 go get my boy. Go get my fetch Aaron. Fetch Aaron. Fetch Aaron. I'm gonna own this police department. I'm gonna own this city too. I'm gonna own all the boys in blue because they're all jackasses too. Constitutional violations. They're violating my constitutional rights. Are they going to get their booking picture now? They want to put me on the booking site so they can all feel good about what they did and share my picture with everyone.
Gonna get lemon pound cake.
I want to see
Gonna
that.
get you some lemon pound cake. Gonna get that lemon pound cake for the Lorraine police.
My favorite pose.
including your holiday favorites.
Civil rights violated by the Popo. Yay! Piggy, 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 violate my civil rights. Piggy, 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 violate my civil rights. They're given the chance. The boys in blue will fuck you too. They will screw you. Fucking pig, we gotta fight. You like to violate rights of disabled veterans.
Did someone order polka?
Piggy, 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 there's a piggy all around me. You don't care about your oath of office. You're gonna wake a guy up from a dead eye sleep so you can rape his constitutional rights. That's right. Piggy, 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 piggy. We got a piggy everywhere, got the piggies everywhere. Trying to arrest me. I applaud you for being such great pigs and doing exactly what you're told. Sucking some cock. Suck that cock. Suck that cock.
With a special thank you from Aaron himself.
I served my country so you guys could do this to me. Thank you. Thank you so much. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I hope you sleep well tonight. I hope you feel good tonight. Hope you get a full meal tonight. Knowing that you're violent.
Now that's what I call Music Lorraine Edition with all.
And Caldelinus is a pussy.
Anyway.
Trying to arrest me.
Bottom line is that was a fun one, a fun moment. They shared all of my stuff, and unfortunately that went viral. Well, I guess fortunately, I guess it went viral. That video got over 750,000 views on TikTok, and I wasn't even on TikTok. People kept saying, "Get on TikTok, get on TikTok, get on TikTok." So I got on TikTok, and immediately I see all the videos that were out, and I was like, "Holy crap!" So the city effectively shared all these videos of me after the arrest and turned me into some viral super thing, whatever this crap is, where everyone knows me everywhere I go. And so, people are going to follow the story. They're going to see what's going on, but it's all based off of, me acting the way that I did. Again, all of that was for my safety. You can believe what you want, but I need to make sure I got a cell with a camera. And so that's kind of where we'll leave the story tonight. We will be back in the next session to get to section 10, and we'll discuss more about how this case has progressed, how people have been involved, and how we move forward at this point. So thank you guys for tuning in tonight, and I apologize that I couldn't get through all of it, but again, it's a lot of sessions to get through. We'll get the next one tomorrow, getting work my tattoo tomorrow, but after that, we'll try to get another session up and get through another hour or two of this, and hopefully look to finish it up in the next session, if not the next one after that. So thank you guys for tuning in tonight. I appreciate you. This has been a live production from AC, from Aaron Knapp Unplugged. Sorry, I was about to go back into my old karaoke routine, be like, from AC Entertainment. Like, where you can be the star of the show. We got $2 buds, $2 Bud Lights, and $2 well drinks. Sunday. We'll say they'll see but you'll only need the edge. Anyway, I apologize there, but thanks for tuning in tonight, and I'll give you guys a heads up on when that next podcast is going to be. I do have all the material already lined out. I just don't have time to get through it tonight, I think, in a reasonable time frame. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time.